RNG talk. I kind of got put on the subject from the Discord server, and RNG in card games is a very touchy subject. Isn't the word I want to use. It is a very nuanced subject. It's been really done to death, I think. But the interesting thing about RNG in card games is that every card game is different. Like, it's kind of like how certain even cards and mechanics that are very similar, or even one-to-one ports from one card game to another, can suddenly become worthless or really overpowered just because it's all about context. And RNG is the same way, where there is a list of like RNG best practices, but then again, like the context can really shift that. So anyway, so honestly, the fact that I'm playing against so much Targon's Peak kind of perfectly segues me into my RNG conversation. Targon's Peak is, again, a deck that's, like, not meant to be viable. It's supposed to be like a Timmy thing. Haha, I get the big bombs, and I get to play them early, and everybody just has a fun time. It's, like, supposed to be balanced by the fact that my opponent can, get their stuff discounted as well, and generally your opponent gets the, well, if you play it on your opponent's attack token and take a bunch of damage, then you get to use the discount first, right? And that's like where Targon's Peak kind of starts to break a bit, where it pretends to balance itself by being a what they call a symmetrical effect, affecting both players, but you get to use the effect first, potentially. It's not always your opponent that gets the effect. And we did discuss briefly, making Targon's Peak only discount a card in one player's hand, but then it alternates, and or some combination of it doesn't discount another card until you use the other card that was discounted. Because if Targon's Peak hits something that is, you know what I mean, that you don't want it to hit, or something you don't want to use at the time, you can just not use that, do your turn as normal, and then Targon's Peak will roll again. It's also about deck building choices, exactly. My discount's more impactful than yours. Very, very early builds of Targon's Peak were running like Kindly Tavern Keeper and stuff, and basically you had to survive against a lot of early aggression. But nowadays, the meta isn't as aggressive. You still have, usually Catalyst and Blighted Ravine are good enough to hold down the early game. We've still got Faces of the Old Ones that can also ramp you. The deck's still running Spacey Sketcher to get rid of certain cheap cards, while still generating you early game tempo stuff. So, I mean, and then of course, again, the buff to She Who Wanders, so it obliterates champions, means that you're just like blowing up your opponent that much harder. But just give me a quick second, y'all. I'm actually pretty cold. I'm gonna go grab a hoodie or something. I'll be right back. Anyway, I'm back. The thing about Targon's Peak is it's a very cool card in that it asks a very interesting deck building question of the player. Cards like Targon's Peak, Bandletree, War Mother's Call are decks that give you very powerful payoffs, but at the same time ask you to build your deck in a very specific, nuanced way to get full effectiveness. And I've said this before, Bandletree is an absolutely toxic card that shouldn't exist, but the deck building that went into making that deck as like dangerously efficient and consistent as it became was certainly a huge credit to the Runeterra community. We essentially took that card, used it in a way that the devs didn't anticipate, and broke it, which is what card gamers do. That's our job, right? Is to take this card and say, how efficient can I make this, right? Like, I can tell you that for certain, a good number of like very broken meta decks have been the result of players using very, very ridiculous deck building practices to level up champions way faster than they were intended to. A great example off the top of my head is Twisted Fate, where players were just like, oh, I can do X, Y, Z and level up Twisted Fate in one turn. This was also a result of just more card draw being added to the game over time. And it was something that, of course, longtime viewers will know that we predicted would happen. That, you know, eventually Twisted Fate would have to get nerfed because as time goes on, just more card draw effects get added to your game. It's just a natural like course of development, because certain cards and designs become very hard to implement when your players don't have card draw in order to make use of these cards or synergies or play at a certain accelerated pace. And we can see, again, this is one of my big arguments for, you know, for Demacia, is that as time has gone on and decks and new regions have been added to the game and new cards have been added to the game, more card draw has been added to certain regions and to certain archetypes, but Demacia has gotten none of it, right? Demacia still has Vanguard, Redeemer, and then they got Dragon Chow for the Dragon archetype. This is very good. This is very good. This is a very cool idea for card draw for Demacia, because you set it up early. It doesn't like fight for the board really. If you chump block with it, you get less potential draw value. You want to save it. It doesn't pay off until like round 4-ish when you're playing like Shyvana and stuff. Dragon Chow is very, very cool card draw for Demacia. And then it's a trade-off, right? Where there's certain board states where if you summon the dragon, your Dragon Chow dies. And so you're exchanging a potential emergency blocker for a card. And then, of course, we just have Redeemer, which is a 3-mana 3/3. Honestly, I might like to see Redeemer be a 3/4. But that kind of leaks into the Scout discussion, the Elites discussion that we had a while ago. The main topic that I wanted to talk about today was RNG. So to reiterate my points, RNG is a very nuanced thing in card games. The big upsides and the fine lines you want to tread, of course, by adding randomness to your games is generally, again, in a broad game design sense, is A, the randomness makes it so that games don't play out the same every single time, even with the same deck, even with the same matchup. A little bit of randomness is still going to make it so that the game will play out a little bit differently, or certain things happen that you weren't expecting. And there is always inherent RNG in card games because of deck shuffling, your card draw, your opening hand. That's offset by mulligans and stuff. But the other goal, of course, of RNG is to make very exciting, tense moments happen, right? Like, oh man, I was about to lose, and then I lucked my way into this specific card, and I was able to, to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. This happens naturally with like just really clutch top decking, or, Yu-Gi-Oh moments of like drawing the right card at the right time and just bam, I win. Mimo says, if RNG can give you unpredictable win conditions, it's no fun at all. That's exactly what I mean, Mimo. It's a very fine line, because if the other thing about it as well is a little bit of randomness can make it so that the better player doesn't always win. And that's a very contentious point, because it plays into psychology and new player satisfaction, where if you are learning a game, especially in the modern era, right? Not to sound like an elitist or a boomer about it, but when I was playing a lot of games growing up, especially competitive games, it was sort of expected that when you were new, you're going to get completely just annihilated by everyone until you finally figure out exactly what you're doing. And to be fair, there's only been a couple decks throughout the history of Runeterra that have been so strong that you can still win games even when you're playing very poorly. And usually RNG doesn't do a whole lot to affect the margin of good player, bad player. as we know in Runeterra, it's a lot more matchup based. Like a bad player on a deck with a favored matchup can still like beat you just because mechanically you can't directly interact with that deck. But also we've seen at the highest levels of play for Runeterra, the matchups are certainly feel a lot closer than they are because win rates and stuff is aggregate from a wide variety of players on the ladder that are A, not necessarily competitive players, B, not perfectly like versed in the matchup itself, and C, don't have their decks constructed with that particular matchup in mind necessarily, because RNG is cool when you play D&D, but not on card games. Scarzig sounded like a total boomer this Gen C in their participation trophies. No. It's not even that, because it's a thing that happened. It was like an era of games, and I don't want to say that, oh, new players should just get completely dunked on for eons, because at the end of the day, there's so many games to play now, right? There's so many games to play. And so if you boot up a game and you're just getting roasted and you can't have fun, you're just not going to play that game. And just over time, developers have recognized that. It's like this. Fighting games have this problem where it's very difficult for them to attract new players, because when you jump into a fighting game, you're getting trashed by the people who have been playing that game since day one, or, you know what I mean? And especially for older fighting games. And to my philosophy, it's not about losing. It's about giving newer players the tools to understand how they can improve and why they lost, right? Because that's why I've been literally since the beta advocating for match replays, the ability to actually go back and watch your gameplay so that you can see, with hindsight, what you maybe could have done a little bit differently to make your play a bit more efficient. So, and this is exactly what I'm talking about. Like the argument that RNG still lets new players feel like they have a chance even when they're really behind versus skilled players is not a big factor for Runeterra. It comes into play for other things, but as I said before, depending on the game, not even just the genre, but the individual game within that genre, certain like quote unquote design principles and best practices go out the window. And Runeterra is touted as a game where skill is king and you want to go light on RNG, and you want the more skilled player to win. And so I think that they still pretty much like hit that goal in general. Like the best players are always the best players. Like hell, even in Hearthstone, a game that's absolutely infested with bad RNG, the best players are still, generally the best players. Mimi says, for any manifest, I really didn't like Loping Telescope. They gave an epic more than other RNG in this game because it pulls as much as mostly epic cards can be win conditions. Yes. I think that kind of segues us into the next basically stage of the discussion, is that there's good RNG and bad RNG. And like good RNG is the kind that your opponent's kind of able to still plan around it. It creates like very cool moment to moment decision making. It makes certain like resolutions not absolutely guaranteed, but there are ways for both players to manipulate those numbers to make that to make those outcomes hit in their favor a little bit more often. And the perfect example of that, of course, is Make It Rain, right? It deals 1 to 3 different randomly targeted enemies or the enemy nexus. And this card is RNG, but it's super easy to manipulate this or time it to where it's going to guaranteed hit 2 units and the nexus. If your opponent has like 4 units in play, you're still going to do like double Make It Rain, or you're going to attack first to try to set up a couple trades or kill a couple things to manipulate the Make It Rain to hit what you want, right? And very rarely there are those Hail Mary games where you've got no other option. You've got to go for Make It Rain, and you're crossing your fingers that it hits just the right targets, or maybe it needs to hit the Nexus for one more damage. And I've been on both ends of that transaction as well, where my opponent goes Make It Rain and they hit my Nexus and I lose, or I just have to YOLO the Make It Rain and the 1 damage hits the Nexus and I'm able to get the lethal. And so that's like the perfect RNG you want. Both players have a meaningful way to participate in it. If I know my opponent's running Make It Rain, then I'm going to go a little bit wider or maybe trade differently in order to minimize the effect of Make It Rain. This card is honestly perfectly designed RNG. And the only reason that it was nerfed before was because literally 2 mana deal 2 mana deal 1 to 3 targets at the time was just too efficient tempo for aggressive decks. This kind of also goes into Ricochet. This is another card that's similar to Make It Rain. I absolutely love this card. And it's further balanced by the fact that it's bad. This is what I like so much about Ricochet, is that you only cast this when you're absolutely backed into a corner. And that kind of accentuates its flavor for Sivir. Make It Rain is fair. If Ebb didn't hit the Nexus, I'd say that was too. RNG is balanced if it's bad. No, Ricochet is a bad card. Like, it's well designed, but it's bad. And it's one of those cards where because it's bad, it's an endearing card because it's bad, if that makes sense. Because then, when you have well-designed cards but are just below the power curve, it means that if you're ever in a position to, like, randomly generate them and then employ them in a creative way or in a situation, then it becomes, like, very cool. Like, if you're running, like, Shurima P&Z with Ferris Financier and you get Ricochet off of Ferris Financier, maybe it bails you out. Examples of bad RNG, Targon's Peak we already talked about. There are some like Conchologist got nerfed. Loping Telescope was I think Loping Telescope is probably the poster child for bad RNG. Even though Manifest is a mechanic where you offset the RNG by using decision making, right? Where it's like Conchologist, because I get to choose one of the cards that are offered to me, it can offset the RNG by just making good choices, but the opponent is left out of that equation. And that's what makes cards like, mechanics like Plundering and Manifesting feel so bad, is because even though the person using that mechanic, has some agency there of, oh, do I want to manifest just the generically good thing, or do I want to manifest this sort of niche thing and try to drive the game in a certain direction to get as much value as I can out of this choice? There is some agency there, but the opponent doesn't get to participate in that meaningfully. And it's the same thing with Plunder. Like, it's cool to get, like, extra tools and resources and try to weave them into your strategy, but your opponent is completely left out in the cold. And that's the key to good RNG, is giving the opponent agency and participating in that random outcome. And I already said that, plundered cards should 100% be face up. Like, the argument against, of course, is you don't want your opponent to have too many face up cards, because then you don't know what to do. It creates like this extra pressure when your opponent has certain cards. It becomes very hard to find just a good line, and the developers would rather you just do something and take a calculated risk rather than trying to find the perfect line and waste a bunch of time. And when it comes to Plunder, I felt like having it face up just, again, fixes a lot of the issues where what pieces are missing from your deck. So then you can start sculpting your strategy and your lines around things that you don't have access to any longer. So it means you aren't getting completely blown up by wasting your time playing towards an out that you don't have. And then your opponent has the extra opportunity to mind game you how do you use a card that your opponent knows is coming? Like, how do you weave that into your strategy? And then you basically start bluffing really hard using your plundered cards, right? For Bilgewater, a region that's based around, like, you know, gambling and pirates and, you know, roguish activities like that, you know, bluffing is actually a big part of the theme and flavor of that region. And I made a whole video about plunder, basically saying that same argument. What another factor when it comes to randomness is the impact of random effects. Like, random effects can cause like small shifts here and there, small give and take in like who's winning, who's losing. It can change your lines a little bit, but the impact of random cards needs to not be game deciding. And I see in the chat y'all brought up Hex Tech Anomaly, which is a card I absolutely despise, because Ferris Financier is a card that lets you manifest a 6+ cost spell from your regions. And already that is a pretty strong pool of cards, right? This card's designed to have synergy with the 6+ cost champions like Lux and Jace and Heimerdinger and, you know, things like Forge of Tomorrow. There's a lot of synergy with those expensive spells. But with that also comes the implication that your opponent gets to cast expensive, powerful spells. Cards like True Shot Barrage that are just a little bit too weak to run in your deck become perfectly acceptable when you play a card that gives you a blocker, a good body in play on curve, and then gives you a resource that you can then spend later. The other card that's tied to Ferris Financier is Hextech Anomaly. When you draw or create me in hand or each round, while I'm in your hand, transform me into a random 6+ cost spell. So then, Hextech Anomaly allows the Ferris Financier to break the from your regions like clause in its card. Like, this actually breaks the card, because then instead of just playing around stuff from PNZ and Shadow Isles, I now have to play around the potential for everything. Hextech Anomaly can transform into like really dastardly stuff, like we know, like Feel the Rush, Harrowing. You know, again, depending on your region combinations, you can get some really nasty stuff off of this. And again, those sorts of expensive spells in Runeterra are usually huge board swinging cards or win conditions. So not being able to properly predict that level of board swinging potential is, from a gameplay perspective and also from a psychological perspective, very unsatisfying. With Mirai Greatmother, if that card was ever good, it would suck. Yeah, Mirai Greatmother is an excellent example of a card that has some fun deck building potential and can make some silly stuff happen, but is basically designed to be bad on purpose. And I think, again, we said that Targon's Peak, I imagine, was sort of designed to be the same way, right? Where Targon's Peak creates some like really crazy, oh wow, I can't believe you played a 10-drop on turn 6. But again, it's a card that, through the active experimentation of the player base, made it way more consistent than it had any right to be. Hextech Anomaly is not a main deck card, so it's not that much of a problem, for my opinion. Yeah, it's like Hextech Anomaly. You don't ever main deck this card, but again, the fact that you can get this off of Ferris Financier and Flash of Brilliance, stuff like that, just means that it puts an extra step, it puts an extra layer of nonsense onto those already random effects that allows you to go even further beyond, right? There's a certain layer of RNG that we're sort of used to that we tolerate, and then Hextech Anomaly, you know, takes that a step further potentially. And that's what I don't like about this card, is the potential for this to break, very specifically, spells that are gated around your PNZ region. It is basically the big issue I have with Hextech Anomaly. If it would just transform into a random spell from your regions, so you basically had this wild card that would keep giving you extra options, and you could sit on it, sit on it, sit on it, there would be some agency there around, do I even take the anomaly off of Ferris Financier if the other two options are bad? Or if I get this off of Flash of Brilliance, if I get offered something, like if your Hextech Anomaly changes into a Shock Blast, do I just use it right now because Shock Blast is a good card? Or do I play as normal and wait for Hextech Anomaly to become something really good? How far can I push my luck? And I feel like Hextech Anomaly is trying to play into that, but because it turns into a spell from all over the game, from all regions, it is too volatile in the impact that it can have. It becomes very dangerous to print new expensive spells that, can go into other regions. The other card that does this is Mage Seeker Conservator. This is the original example of like terrible RNG from the beta. This card was part of the base set, and it didn't see a wide amount of play, but Mage Seeker Conservator getting it creates a region other than Demacia, so you aren't getting like judgment off of this, which Ferris Financier, Hextech Anomaly, and stuff like that can get you. But it would get stuff like Harsh Winds and War Mother's Call and Progress Day. Like even back in the base set, Mage Seeker Conservator could hit some nonsense. And like I said, a certain level of uncertainty also means that we don't have games like decided by one side or the other. If your opponent just feels that they can still random their way into something to find a win. But again, in Runeterra, a lot of the matches are, again, very matchup dependent, where it's like the match is kind of already decided around certain outcomes regardless by certain turns. Like Sundisk is a great example, right? Like, if they don't flip the Sundisk on turn 6 or turn 7, well, nowadays it's turn 8. Like, if their Zareth is at the bottom of the deck and I get a few extra rounds than I normally would get on average, then I can find some wins, right? And so you'll play the game out, but there's no like RNG that's going to save you from that. A lot of, win cons in the game are so strong because there's fewer ways for the opponent to interact with or disrupt them. And that, of course, is also the goal of card games, is we want to make certain outcomes as consistent and efficient as possible. And we also want to use ways to win that are as uninteractive as possible. That's just the natural evolution of how meta decks become meta decks. Tasteless Casual says, people love to be rewarded from planning, so something that breaks it quite a lot outside of our draw RNG feels so bad for opponents. Yeah, like Loping Telescope. We all saw the discussion around Loping Telescope, where because it's like the variety of cards that it could get was just so varied, it just became like irrelevant to even try to play around anything. It wasn't like you were trying to account for what your opponent got. You just had to play the game out as though they got something bad that they couldn't play. So that's basically what makes like really poor, unsatisfying RNG, is that when a random card or a random effect has like a massive impact on the game and basically just invalidates everything you did, or most everything you did on the way up to that point. Treasured Trash is another card that, ironically, because it creates cards from all over the game, it's a little bit worse because there's a very high chance that you do get trash. And I've seen it happen where Treasured Trash gets you like the perfect cards, and we've seen it where Treasured Trash gets you absolutely terrible cards. This is the sort of card that never should be meta. It's been like a cheeky one of in certain lists in Bandle City, just in case you wanted to Hail Mary into a winning line. But this is kind of like if Treasure Trove was ever a main deckable card, or there was some deck that could consistently get Treasure Troves, it would feel very terrible. One thing that basically allows Treasure Trove to exist is the fact that the treasures force you to build your deck in a very specific way. and jump through a lot of hoops to get the treasure trove, right? Hey, it's a fun, silly card. They made it 10 mana on purpose because you don't want this to be like a real option for your deck, but it's just something that maybe, and we see it from time to time in the competitive scene where players will bring a deck to a tournament with one treasured trash, and then that deck will lose anyway, and then the person who won because they weren't running treasured trash and they were running a card that actually had more consistent early mid-game value just said, oh no, don't run treasure trash, it's actually a bait. That's also a deck building decision and a philosophical decision in and of itself is, do I run a card that's slightly worse on average, but it gives me the ability to sometimes just completely win games I have no right winning? Treasure Trash maybe gets a pass by the fact that it does present like a very interesting decision like that, but if there was ever a list or some sort of like deck, you know what I mean, that was unironically running triple treasured trash because they were able to discount it somehow. Like if they ever do like the nonsense that Hearthstone likes to do with mana cheating, where it's like, oh, draw a spell and reduce its cost by X. Like, you know, for damn sure people are going to be running that with treasured trash or Feel the Rush or whatever. One of the earliest examples in the game of like really rough RNG was actually Karma and Karma's Insight of Ages. The spells are from your regions, which is nice, but you just basically you generate so many of them that it offsets the randomness. This is kind of the other way to do it. When something is random, but if you do it over and over and over again, the average of getting the outcomes you want goes up. And Lurk is actually a fantastic example of a deck that's basically built on that principle. Lurk procs are random, but you build your deck to make the lurks happen as consistently as you can. And then you have other mechanics like predict and things like that to also manipulate those things to happen consistently. From your regions has been like the classic way that Runeterra has gated RNG to give you a good idea of what you need to play around. This is going to become less and less relevant as more cards are added to the game, because as there's more and more cards added, there's more and more things to consider and play around, so then you can't really play around anything meaningfully. And then, you know, there's also the average of you're still going to be hitting a lot of bad cards to balance out hitting good cards. The other thing that works against randomness in card games is the psychological aspect, right? Is even though, like, mathematically across, you know, 100 games, 200 games, Karma generating a spell that wins versus generating garbage that you never see and doesn't affect the game at all is, you know, probably just a stable within parameters type of statistic. But you only see and you only remember the games when the card that Karma created is the thing that kills you and blows you up, right? Like, this was one of the arguments versus Plunder, right? Like, oh, well, sometimes your opponent plunders cards that they can't use, or they never use the card that they plundered, so it doesn't matter that they took your card. And that is a very, very dishonest way to evaluate that mechanic. That's a very dishonest way. That's like super bad faith argument to make for Plunder specifically. For Karma, it applies perhaps a little bit more. Other RNG, like Warden's Prey, there are some high roll potentials, but this isn't like too bad of a card. Usually, I think what it comes down to, again, it's all about impact, where if everything you can get from a random pool is roughly the same power level, there's always going to be like the stuff that's like at the top of the top and the stuff that's at the bottom of the bottom. But as long as that band is like pretty narrow, it's fine. Like Warden's Prey, Bomber Twins pushes this a little bit. You can get completely worthless junk like Ripper's Bay, but then you can get really good stuff like Preservarium and Hexplosive Minefield. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing with Bomber Twins, is that the variance is what balances it. When I play Bomber Twins, I'm like, ooh, I wonder if I'll get Hexplosive Minefield or if I'll get Preservarium, right? If I get something bad, I can just discard it. So Mirai Warden is just like Warden's Prey. It's similar to, of course, Island Navigator, where a 1-cost follower does have some high roll stuff, it has some low roll stuff, but the general, 1-drops are generally like 2-1s, and anything that deviates from that, if it's a 2-1 or a 2-2, is just marginally better than just playing a House Spider. So everybody's kind of chill with Mirai Warden, right? Flash Bombs, I think, are a great example of good RNG, actually, because the 1 damage is a little bit it goes on random targets, but again, you can go wide to kind of disrupt the flash bombs hitting certain things versus not. You can choose not to develop until the start of the next round in case the flash bombs trigger at the start of the round. You can make decisions based on how many flash bombs you have in the deck versus how many rounds and how many cards you've drawn without hitting a flash bomb to make a decision about how you want to play the game. And I think that flash bomb's like, of course, there's the famous Yamato flash bomb that, basically allowed him to win that crazy game during Worlds. And it was so crazy to be in the Discord call when that happened. But that's the perfect thing you want with RNG. There's a lot of subtlety around making this card as effective as possible. Your opponent trying to manipulate the outcomes as much as they can to minimize its effect, having to push their luck here and there by needing to draw cards. And then you get those crazy high moments where the flash bomb hits the perfect target at the perfect time. And so flash bombs are actually perfectly designed, in my opinion. And I don't even know if they ever wanted to even buff flash bombs the way they did at all by making it top 8 rather than top 10. By making the flash bombs a little bit more consistent, it means that playing around flash bombs is also a more consistently valuable play. So ironically, by making flash bombs better, it makes playing around flash bombs better, if that makes sense. Like, you get rewarded more for being a galaxy brain because flash bombs hit more consistently and faster. Trap mechanics, especially mushrooms, are another RNG mechanic that you offset by just putting it, building your deck and doing certain effects to make the outcome so consistent that the fact that it's random stops becoming, just basically becomes irrelevant. Zap Spray Fin is another good example, right? Where the spell that it gets you is random, but you just build your deck in a certain way so that Zap Spray Fin is only going to get you certain cards, right? Like Pirate Aggro is a deck that probably really wants to run Brothers Bond or something, but doesn't want to because it messes with the RNG of Zap Spray Fin consistently drawing Make It Rain and Noxian Fervor. And then back in TF Elise Go Hard, there were players that would actually cut a copy of Glimpse Beyond from the deck, so you had less card draw, like direct card draw, to have a better shot at tutoring for Go Hard instead off of Zap Spray Fin. Very, very subtle mathematical manipulations there. Zap Spray Fin, of course, like the ability to tutor for a card is its strength because you just build your deck in a certain way. If it was not for Flash Bomb, Yamato would be our world champion. Yeah, that is true. That is true. Prank, oh god. Also pretty rough. Prank is another one of those mechanics that doesn't really get talked about because the way it ended up landing, the way Prank ended up kind of landing in the collective consciousness of the player base is that it's just completely tied to the viability of Shellfolk. And I'm so glad that this didn't become just a generically strong playable mechanic that I was really hoping that wouldn't happen. When Prank first came out, there was like Fizz Otterpuss like tempo where you would use Prank to slow down your opponent's hand and then you were just like beating them up. And Prank can hit like some really dastardly outcomes. But at the end of the day, it's mostly just tied to Shellfolk. Yeah, and again, like cards like Double Trouble that summon random 1-drops, again, very mild outcomes. Even if you get like good 1-drops, they're still just 1-drops, right? That's the thing. Of course, there's, like I already pointed out, Mage Seeker Conservator is the gateway into nonsense. And I was really hoping that they would nerf or rework this card, because this card is certainly an abomination. When this card pulls something, it's very, very hard to like realistically play around what this thing does. And generally speaking, nobody main decks this card. You only get it off of other random effects like Warden's Prey, Mirai Warden, and Jailbreak, etc., etc., etc. So it's a random card that creates a random card, and so it adds insult to injury. And it's the same with Hextech Anomaly, where you don't run Hextech Anomaly, but because it's another step in a layer, in onion layers and layers of RNG, it makes the outcome feel even worse because you know that your opponent got lucky twice. And so, again, to properly summarize the goals of RNG and, you know, how to make good RNG. The goals of RNG is to add spice to the games, make it so the games don't play out the same every single time, create underdog opportunities, allow players to employ, you know, random resources in creative ways, rewarding, you know, knowledge of the card pool or your ability to manipulate the game state to affect those outcomes, adds a little bit of skill expression, right? And then, you know, the downsides of RNG, bad RNG, is where the impact of those outcomes is just too high and just invalidates the gameplay that has happened up till that point. 2, there's no way for the other player to meaningfully participate in those random outcomes or play around them before they resolve, and just they have to hold that L. And 3, the random outcome being something that is just something that puts too much of a burden on one player to try to properly process those random outcomes. But then, of course, there's just good RNG as well that gets you cards from a very narrow pool, so it's easy to account for everything, right? Like Solari Priestess, I think, is a fantastic example. Yeah, it's like she doesn't even pop up in random, which is funny because it's Invoke. But Invoke, it's not as zany as Manifest, with like Loping Telescope and Conchologist, because the variety of cards you could get was so wide. It meant that you couldn't properly account for what your opponent might have gotten. And same thing with Plunder, where the variety of things your opponent could get is too wide to account for. So you end up accentuating the power level of your opponent's random outcome because you're walking face first into it. And Loping Telescope is the poster child of that from the modern era because of like Judgment and Ruination and Rite of Negation, right? Like these very impactful cards that you can try to play around them. And by playing around them, you have to play inefficiently. And then if you don't, their power level is maximized because they're the sorts of cards that completely take you out of the game when you walk face first into them. But then we have like Invokes where, you know, it, especially like Solari Priestess, again, like 4, 5, and 6, there's only 6 Celestial cards in this pool. It's Written in Stars, the Traveler, Meteor Shower, the Warrior, and then Golden Sister, and Falling Comet. Wow, I can't believe I forgot Falling Comet. Anyway, yeah, so again, a very narrow band of stuff that you can account for and play around. And these are all, like, outside of Written in Stars, they're all slow speed. They don't affect the board state immediately. So you also have extra agency by just not developing at the start of your turn, going for open attacks, or playing very lightly, not overcommitting, to see if your opponent is going to put down the Golden Sister or Written in Stars, or saving your specific power cards so they don't get scooped up by Meteor Shower or Falling Comet. There's a lot of agency there. I don't know if this is true for anybody else, but for me personally, you know, even if I do win a game that was, you know, up in the air because of some random decision that had to be made, like, even if I do come out on the winning side of that outcome, the game, like, still feels really, like, invalidated to me regardless. You know what I mean? Like, when I play against Targon's Peak, like, if I checked my numbers, I'm pretty sure I have a positive win rate versus Targon's Peak, but I still feel like those games were coin flips because my opponent could have still dropped She Who Wanders on 6 against me in any of those games, and it just hasn't happened yet. And so again, that plays into like the psychological aspects of randomness. And so ironically, the way to quote unquote fix randomness is to kind of increase the player base's tolerance to randomness. Like when Bilgewater was added to the game, everybody hated it pretty much because of Plunder, but they also hated the RNG of Make It Rain. Even though in hindsight, we understand now that Make It Rain is a perfectly designed card. It's super easy for both players to play around it. The baseline power of I deal 1 to this, 1 to this, and 1 to your Nexus is pretty much like the expected outcome of Make It Rain. Like, when that card first came out, everybody hated it because it was a random card. And it's like, oh, you know, Runeterra doesn't have any randomness. And of course it did in the base set. We already talked about Karma and Mage Seeker Conservator. But again, it was low randomness. And so over time, the player base has gotten, hell, even Elnux technically was like a huge RNG card that would blow you up in like the beta. And I hope that Runeterra can properly, you know, accentuate well-designed randomness going forward. If they keep adding RNG to the game, we will potentially get an increased tolerance for randomness and start to like accept more and more random effects. And that's the biggest issue with Runeterra, is because it was started as a very light RNG game and sort of marketed as such, so that now when they're adding more random effects, the player base just hates it, just absolutely hates it. It becomes a design bottleneck where they might want to add certain cool mechanics and effects, but they always have to be afraid that this random effect has some way to become broken because we figure out a way to make it more consistent, or this random effect might be cool and balanced, but we just hate it regardless because it's random. And the other thing about randomness that I guess that I forgot to talk about is that you can make stronger effects, and then use their randomness to balance them out, right? Gotcha, I guess they kind of already did this. 4 mana deal 3 is a little bit inefficient, but then because of the draw RNG, there's a way to like make that a little bit more efficient if it's like you happen to top deck into this. And same thing with Suit Up, right? 4 mana to grow something to a 4/4 isn't that good, but if you play this for 2, it's nutty. That's another way that randomness can be used as a design and balancing lever. If you have your player base sort of prepped to accept a certain level of randomness, it gives you a blank slate to do more effects of that nature.